Hello everyone, welcome back to Wing Leader Flight Training with me, Evil Dr. Ganymede. And today we are going to tackle flak and bombing. We're going to venture into the advanced rules for Wing Leader. And they're not actually as complicated as they might sound, but there are a few things that you've got to wrap your head around. So we'll go over them probably together because flak and bombing tends to happen at the same time when a squadron is attacking a ground target. So what we've got here is scenario V9, like arrows against gladiators, which pits Italian G50 squadrons against British Gladiator Mark IIs and Blenheim Mark I bombers. And the British are on their way to bomb an Italian supply dump in Greece in 1941 here, and the Italians are defending the dump. And also the dump is shown here, and that has a light flak battery protecting the supply. So the British are going to come in from the right, the Italians set up on the left here. There is an alternate setup for the Italians where one of the squadrons can start at altitude 6, but the other one has to start at 0. But I went for the basic setup where one is at 4 and one is at 2. And we've got this interesting broken cloud bank in the way. And the Italians are heading towards these vectors directly ahead of them. And the bombers are back here, the S&T squadron. And the gladiators, we've got a sweep in front of them and we've got an escort below. And if we have a look at the wing display, all of them are rigid doctrine, all of the fighters on both sides, and there's an expert on the British side, that's the sweep, and one of the Italian squadrons is a green squadron. And the British start off unalerted, the Italians start off alerted here. So the planes are pretty straightforward in this scenario. Nobody has actually got a bonus ability like eggs or anything like that. The Blenheims are the S&T squadron. They obviously have bomb loads, and everyone else has nothing and also has 0 firepower as well. So it's going to be fairly straightforward on that front. So generally, I think what's going to happen is that the bombers are going to come down to a low altitude, probably around altitude 2, and then start their bombing run on the supply dump, drop their bombs over the dump, and then probably just head off the left side of the map here. So since we're actually using the advanced rules, this is slightly different to the scenarios that we've seen already, which are using the basic rules. In the basic rules, the bombers carry on in a straight line and they either don't drop any bombs during the scenario, or if they do, they drop them in a sort of simplified way. When they get to a specific column, it'll just say, when they get to here, the bombers drop their bombs and they score 2 victory points or 3 victory points or whatever. But in this, the advanced rules are actually going to go through a proper bombing run where they can have a bit more flexibility. So here in the advanced rules, the missions actually are modified. The bombing, sweep and escort missions are changed so that they can do what they're actually intended to do. And this is all described in section 15 of the rules in the advanced section. The bombers can actually change their altitude now. They don't just move in a straight line 2 squares forward every time. They can change their altitude because if they want to drop their bombs most effectively, they have to get to a specific kind of altitude range. And that largely depends on their bomb sites. So now that I've got the wing display up, if we have a look at the Blenheim here, you'll see it has a bomb site of V. When we have a look at the bombing table, which I will put up in the top right corner, you will see that there is an altitude modifier table that has various different types of bomb site, the T, the S, the V and the G, and an altitude range on the left there. The higher the bombers are when they drop their bombs, the harder it is for their bombers to hit and do damage effectively on the target. you can see there that obviously if they're flying ridiculously high, like 15 squares, they're going to get a -4 modifier on their bombing roll, which is terrible. What you want to do, like in the rest of the game really, is try and optimize things so that they get the maximum possible positive modifiers that they can. So that means you want to drop your bombs where your altitude modifier is 0. And in the case of V, that is at altitude 1 to 2. So let's go for the highest possible altitude. That is 0 in, which is altitude 2. The bombers are starting off at altitude 7. They can only change their altitude by 1 level per turn. So it's going to take them 5 turns to get to altitude 2. So they have to get down here, ideally. If for some reason they're prevented from doing that, and they have to end up going higher, then they're going to get some penalties on their bombing roll. That's what the bombers can do. Instead of just flying in a straight line, they can actually change their altitude level, a maximum of 1 level per turn. They all have to change their altitude in the same phase if they're in the same formation. In this case, these guys are not. They're actually 2 separate bomber squadrons. So theoretically, one can change altitude while the other one doesn't. But chances are we're probably going to have both of them changing at the same time. And they also do not receive the +1 movement point modifier when they dive. That's the basic changes from the standard bombing missions. The escorts can also change their altitude depending on what their bombers are doing. And the thing here is that the bombers can actually order them to become sweeps. In the admin phase, they can do that once per scenario. And that means that all the escorts just automatically switch to being sweeps, and they start acting like sweeps. And as sweeps, they can reform back up with the bombers as escorts later on, but that's it. They can't all be ordered to turn into sweeps again by the bombers. As sweeps, they now have the option of circling so that they can just stay in one square. So that's a way to pause them, especially if bombers are moving into a flak zone and they don't want the escorts getting shot up. Then the escort can turn into sweeps and then wait outside circling until the bombers either come back or move through it, and then they can resume their flight. Sweeps can also strafe. That's another new thing in the advanced rules that we're not going to get into in this video or this scenario, but I'll probably do a video on that later because that's a bit more complicated. But strafing, as you might imagine, involves using their guns to attack ground targets as opposed to dropping bombs on them. That's the main big changes to the missions anyway. The other thing I'll point out is that there is no ground control here. The Italians are each on their own radio net, so A is on radio net C and B is on radio net D. And the British are also on their own radio nets per squadron, so Q is on A and R is on RadioNet B. As far as I can gather, the only really significant effect of each squadron having their own radio net is that they don't get a -1 penalty on their cohesion roll because they don't have a radio. But they don't get any of the advantages of being on a radio net either, because the bonuses involve other squadrons doing something, but because they're all on their own self-contained net, they won't actually get that. Because there's no ground control, the Italians as well are going to fly to their intercept vector spots here, and if somehow they don't manage to spot the incoming planes, then they are essentially just sitting there circling and that's it. There's no way to reassign the vectors, so they're going to have to hope that they are going to be able to see these planes as they come in. Or maybe they'll see them and they'll attack them. They're going to just circle there until they succeed in a tally roll, and if they don't succeed in a tally roll, then that's all they're going to do. So what I'm going to do is just start playing, and we're going to get into the position where we're going to see what the flak and bombing actually does and how that works, and I'll explain all that then. And if anything interesting happens in the meantime, I'll come back to the gameplay, but if not, we'll resume when we get a lot closer and I'll update you on what happened on the way there. So we are now in turn 5 and the bombers are getting close to their target, but they are being harried by the G50s. The A squadron here got up to its vector point and circled until it tallied the lead Blenheim, and then the lead Blenheim entered its square, so they had a fight which was inconclusive. No losses, nobody broke or anything. And then in this square, the G50B squadron managed to tally the Blenheim T bomber squadron. The Gladiator R, which was formerly up here, couldn't see anyone, decided to return to base and then get under the clouds where they could suddenly spot that there was a big combat going on under here. So they finally managed to tally somebody. So they tallied the B squadron and attacked them as they were attacking the Blenheims. A combat ensued. The Blenheim took a loss, but nobody else did, although the B squadron did get disrupted, and because they were involved in another combat that saw the Gladiator Q squadron off, they broke them and they are currently running away. So the G50B squadron is now at -2 ammo. They're depleted, so they're at a bigger disadvantage in the next round. But what's happened now is that because both of those fighter squadrons are still actually unbroken, the Gladiators wanted to keep the G50s in a dogfight. If you have unbroken fighter squadrons in a combat, at the end of that combat, they can decide whether they want to have a dogfight. And we haven't done that before because in every combat that we've seen in these videos, one side was broken, so a dogfight couldn't actually happen. But in this case, now we've got the possibility of a dogfight. The Gladiators did want to have a dogfight. The G50s did not want to have a dogfight because they would rather go attack the bombers. To determine whether a dogfight actually happens, you have to either both agree to have it or both agree not to have one. But if one side wants a dogfight and the other side doesn't, then you have to roll a 1d6 and you have to add each side's basic speed. So remember, that includes whether they're diving or having bomb loads or anything like that. You add a +1 if they're veteran or -1 if they're green, and you add a +1 if the defender used evasion or is in a Lufbury in the combat that just happened. If the player that wanted the dogfight rolls higher, then there will be a dogfight. If the player that didn't want a dogfight rolls higher, then there will not be a dogfight. And I have just done that, and it was close, but the Gladiator actually won. They rolled a 2. So there is going to be a dogfight now. That means at least the T bomber will carry on unmolested, because now the tally from the G50B squadron is going to switch now to the Gladiators. So they are going to allow the bombers to escape while they deal with the fighters. Meanwhile, here in the next turn, the G50s will continue to chase the Blenheim S squadron, which are all now getting rather close to the supply dump here that is the target of the bombing run. That is everything. We've already adjusted everything here. These tallies are going to remain. Neither side can actually drop the tally now until one of them is broken. So the only way you leave a dogfight is by winning it, or you're broken. That's it. You can't escape a dogfight at an earlier point. If the combat doesn't end in a dogfight, then theoretically one side could drop the tally on the other and then move out of the square in the next turn. They wouldn't be able to tally anyone before then. They would move out of the square, and then the other side, with the tally still on the squadron that's leaving, would then be able to either follow them or they'd drop the tally and go somewhere else or whatever. In a dogfight, you can't do that. Both sides are committing to attacking each other and nobody else. So this dogfight will continue to the death, essentially, now. And the thing with this as well is that it involves the fighters only. So even though the Blenheim was in the fight, the fighters get into the dogfight, because the point of them really is that if you are defending bombers or transports or whatever, you want to lock up the planes that are attacking them into dogfights so that you either damage them severely enough that if they survive and you don't, then they're not going to be a very effective force against the bombers when they chase them down later on, or you survive and you break them and they go running home with their tails between their legs, so to speak. So you don't want to let them get away and continue to attack the bombers, because your job is to protect them and stop that from happening. So this is why the gladiators wanted a dogfight here, because they wanted to keep those G50s away. They can't do much about these guys because the other gladiator flight unfortunately got broken earlier on, so they're running away already. So the bombers are going to have to try and deal with these on their own. So that is the end of turn 5. And in the admin phase, these guys are just going to escape because nobody is interested in chasing them down. So they are done. Now we are going to move up to turn 6. And this is coincidentally where things will start getting interesting. A still has their tally on Blenheim S. But before the bombers move, if you have a look at the move order, the first thing that actually happens is that the dogfight moves. And the dogfight moves in a specific way. The dogfight is treated as one big stack. And again, the fighters are the only ones involved in the dogfight, not the bombers. To determine who moves the dogfight for a start, you have to roll the d6. On a 1 to 3, the raiders will move the stack. And on a 4 to 6, the defenders will move the stack. Looking at the scenario, we see that the raiders are the British. So on a 1 to 3, the British will move the stack. If the stack moves, it can move into an adjacent square at the same or lower altitude. That's it, just one square. It doesn't cost anyone any movement points or anything. It's just the whole furball, really, I guess is what you'd call it, will just move one square in one of these directions. And if they go down an altitude level, then everyone gets a dive marker on them. And if they stay at the same altitude level, then they don't. So let's roll the d6 and see who moves it. It's a 2. So the raiders will move it. Now the British, the gladiator, does not want this dogfight to follow the bombers. They want to keep the attackers away. So they're going to move this stack back one square so that these will get some distance from it. Because that way, if the gladiators don't survive, then the G50s have got to potentially work harder to catch up with the Blenheims, take longer to do so, and that might be long enough to make a difference. That's it. This has moved. Now the bombers will move. So the Blenheim S squadron will move 2 squares forward. And then the G40s will spend 1 movement point to flip around, and then 2, 3 to catch them. And then these bombers will move 1, 2, and you see the other squadrons are locked up in this dogfight here. They're not going to move after them, so these Blenheims are unmolested. So that's the movement done, but we still have to resolve combat. We have the dogfight back here, and we have the G50s who are still harassing these Blenheims at the front. So let's do the combat at the front first. So the G50s are the attackers, because the Blenheims have to be the defenders. The G50s are going to pick a hit and run combat, which is speed. So they had a speed of 4 at this altitude, so that's their base speed there. And they don't get any modifiers to their rating. So it's just a straight 4 for them. The Blenheims have a speed of 3, but they are modified to a 2 because they are still carrying bombs. And they also have no further modifier. They do not get the defending using rigid doctrine modifier because that only applies to fighters, and Blenheims are bombers. So that's it. It's a +2 and a -2. And there is no further modifiers on the dice rolls, so it's just a straight roll on both sides. So let's see what happens. So this is the attacker. It's 11. That is pretty darn good. they are going to get 3 hits on the Blenheims. And the defenders, the Blenheims, are going to get nothing. So that's a good hit on the S Squadron. 3 hits. The Blenheims in this case are Blenheim Mark 1s. And Blenheim Mark 1s have a protection value of 3 to 4. There's no modifiers to the losses roll because nobody's got any firepower to add, and there's no bonuses. So it's just going to be 3 straight D6 rolls on the Blenheims. We have 5, that's a loss. Another 5, that's another loss. A 1 with no modifier, that is a no loss. So we've got 2 losses. That is not great at all for the Blenheims there. And then we have to make our cohesion rolls. So the attackers are the G50s. They have a +1 for being the attacker, but they have a -1 for already having a low ammo. So there's no modifier to the roll. They rolled a 5. That means that they are disrupted. The Blenheims, on the other hand, have a -2 because they lost 2 bombers and they do not have any other modifiers. So they're going to get -2 to their roll. They got an 8. -2 is 6. That is not enough to even disrupt a bomber squadron though. So they're still solid. The only other thing after that is that A gets their ammo flipped to depleted. They're very fragile now as well because they've got a -2 to their cohesion roll. Now the dogfight. So dogfights are automatically turn combats. They cannot be speed combats. The planes are maneuvering around each other here. They're all just contained in the square, battling out. The attacker is going to be the side with the squadron that has the higher basic turn value. So at the moment then, like, these dives are off because nobody is actually diving anymore. This is all happening in the same square. Whoever's got the highest basic turn is going to be the attacker here. So the G50B squadron has a turn of 4, so we're at altitude 2. The gladiators, on the other hand, they may be slow, but they are darn maneuverable. They have a turn of 5. So the gladiators will be the attacker and will remain as such, really, for as long as this lasts. So the gladiators actually have an advantage here, interestingly. Combat turn value, though, is going to be different. So this is what we're starting off at. This is the basic turn values. And then for the attacker, who is the gladiator, they're going to actually get a -1 here because they're a flight. The G50s are green, so they're getting a -1. They are also disrupted, so they're getting a -1 again. And they are defending using rigid doctrine, so they're getting another -1. So this is tipped greatly in the gladiators' favour. So note to self, gladiators are great in dogfights. So we've got a +3 in favour of the gladiators. The defender, however, can evade, and their speed is higher than the gladiators, so the defender is going to evade. So they're going to get a -1 because they're evading. The gladiators do have the expert here, so that cancels the -1 for the evading, so it's going to be a straight roll on the +3 column, and please roll high. That's a 10. So 10 on the +3 is 3 hits. So the gladiators have got 3 hits on the G50s. The G50s are evading, so they've got a -1 on their roll on the -3 column. And that's a 5, so that's no hit. So the gladiators are going to inflict 3 hits on the G50s. Now the gladiators have an expert, so we've now actually got a +1 on the losses roll, even though the firepower is 0, because there's a +1 modifier if the primary combatant has expert. So we've got D6 +1. Protection on the G50s is 4, so high numbers please. A 1, a 6, and a 3. So the 6 is a loss, the 3 is modified to a 4, that is a straggler. Then the cohesion rolls. So for the attacker, which is the gladiator, our squadron, they are at no losses. no veteran or green. The expert doesn't matter here. They are the attackers, so they get a +1. They do have low ammo, so that cancels out. So it's just a straight roll. Are they going to roll high? They're not. So Gladiator is broken. Remember, they're a flight, so they will break if they get a 6 or less. And the B squadron here, they have taken 1 loss. They are green, so that's -2. They are depleted ammo, so that's -4. So they're going to have to roll pretty high here. They roll a 6, -4 is 2, they are also broken. So the only one that's any trouble here at the moment is the G50s at the front. This dogfight is now over. If they both had survived that, then the dogfight would continue till the next round. But that's it, they are done.